On February 8, 1945, inside the high-security perimeter of Peenemünde, Nazi Germany's most secretive weapons research facility, a man weighing only 38 kilograms stood on the precipice of an impossible act. He was about to steal a bomber, specifically a Heinkel HE-111, a massive twin-engine aircraft with a wingspan of 74 feet, designed to be flown by pilots with months of specialized training. Mikhail Devyatayev had never sat in the cockpit of a Heinkel, had never touched German flight controls, and could not read the German instruments that monitored the machine's complex systems. He was Soviet prisoner of war number 104534, a walking skeleton dressed in striped rags who had not eaten a full meal in 8 months, and whose arms were so atrophied he could barely lift them above his shoulders. Yet, in exactly 47 minutes, this dying man intended to climb into the pilot's seat, start both engines, taxi past armed guards, take off from one of the most heavily defended airfields in the Third Reich, and fly 300 kilometers across enemy territory while being hunted by the Luftwaffe in ground batteries. The Heinkel required 50 pounds of force on the control column just to lift the nose during takeoff. A physical feat that seemed insurmountable for a man who weighed 84 pounds total. He would attempt this escape with 9 other prisoners, men so starved they had forgotten what strength felt like, knowing that capture meant immediate execution. They had no weapons, no tools, no maps, no radios, and no training on German aircraft, but they possessed the one thing that the Nazi war machine could not account for, which was a Soviet fighter pilot who absolutely refused to die in a concentration camp. To understand the sheer magnitude of this desperate gamble, one must look back to July of 1944, 6 months prior to the escape. Lieutenant Mikhail Devyatayev was a celebrated ace in the Soviet Air Force, banking his Yak-1 fighter through anti-aircraft fire over Lviv with 17 confirmed kills and 2 orders of the Red Banner to his name. He was one of the best. But even the best can be caught, and a German Focke-Wulf attacked him from above, sending cannon rounds tearing through his engine. The Yak shuddered and dropped, forcing Devyatayev to bail out at 2,000 feet, landing directly into the waiting arms of German soldiers. He was transferred to a prisoner of war camp, but he could not suppress the fighter pilot's instinct to resist. He tried to escape, was caught, tried again, and was caught again. After his third attempt, the Germans reclassified him from a standard prisoner of war to a dangerous subversive and sent him to Sachsenhausen, a concentration camp where 30,000 prisoners lived in the shadow of gas chambers, and the death rate hovered around 800 per month. Devyatayev arrived in late summer of 1944, a decorated hero reduced to a number, working 12-hour shifts on 700 calories a day. He watched men collapse around him and saw the smoke rise from the crematorium every night, deciding then and there that he would not let this place be his grave. In October of 1944, the Nazis inadvertently provided the solution to his problem when they needed prisoners with technical skills for a secret facility. Devyatayev volunteered, having no idea where he was going, but knowing that anywhere was better than waiting to die in Sachsenhausen. He was transported to Peenemünde on the island of Usedom on the Baltic Sea coast, arriving at night. By morning, he understood the significance of his new prison. Rockets rose from the ground like giant bullets, revealing that this was the birthplace of the V-1 and V-2 missiles that were raining terror on London. Devyatayev was assigned as a slave laborer at the airfield adjacent to the rocket facility, but his eyes were drawn not to the missiles, but to the airplanes. He saw Heinkel bombers on the tarmac, Messerschmitt fighters taxiing to runways, and transport planes landing constantly. He began to watch everything with the analytical mind of a pilot, noting flight schedules, observing which aircraft were fueled, and memorizing the patrol patterns of the guards. He realized that while he was a slave laborer to them, he remained a fighter pilot with 17 kills, and if he could get into a cockpit, he became dangerous. The obstacle was that German planes were fundamentally different from the Soviet fighters he knew. The Heinkel cockpit contained over 100 switches, labeled in a language he could not read, and his experience was limited to single-engine fighters, whereas the Heinkel was a heavy, complex twin-engine bomber. The average prisoner at Peenemünde survived only 8 weeks, and Devyatayev had already been there for 3, so he began studying immediately. Every work detail became a reconnaissance mission as he watched mechanics service engines and pilots run pre-flight checks. He memorized the physical movements of the pilots, matching instrument positions to functions through sheer observation. One specific aircraft caught his attention, a Heinkel HE-111 with the markings GA on its fuselage. It belonged to the deputy commandant and was kept in constant readiness for urgent flights, meaning it was always fueled and always ready. Devyatayev picked his target, but he needed a crew. In a concentration camp, trust was a dangerous luxury, as the guards deliberately used informants to report on escape attempts in exchange for extra food. The system was designed to destroy solidarity, so Devyatayev had to recruit slowly and carefully, looking for men who were strong enough to help and desperate enough to have nothing left to lose. He started with Ivan Krivonogov, a former Soviet sergeant and a large man who, even after months of starvation, retained a formidable presence. Krivonogov had already attempted to escape twice from other camps and had been beaten nearly to death both times, reaching a point where he no longer cared whether death came from an escape attempt or from exhaustion. Through Krivonogov, Devyatayev recruited others, testing each man with small conversations before revealing the plan. He brought in Vladimir Sokolov, a tank mechanic captured at Kursk who understood engines, and Mikhail Yemets, an infantry soldier who was small, quick, and good for stealth. He found Pyotr Kuturgin, an artillery observer known for his calm under fire. One by one, Devyatayev built his team until he had 9 men plus himself, 10 desperate prisoners planning to steal an airplane against absurd odds. They had no weapons to overpower guards and no detailed knowledge of airfield security protocols, so the plan relied entirely on surprise. No prisoner had ever tried to steal an aircraft, so the guards did not defend against it, focusing instead on fence cutters and tunnel diggers. The plan was terrifyingly simple. Step 1 was to eliminate the guard quietly and take his uniform. Step 2 was to march the other prisoners across the airfield as a work detail, led by the man in the stolen uniform, a sight that was common enough to pass unnoticed. Step 3 was to reach aircraft GA and overpower any personnel nearby. Step 4 was to get inside, start the engines, and take off before anyone realized what was happening. Step 5 was to fly 300 kilometers east to Soviet lines. Each step carried the potential for fatal failure. If they marched wrong, they would be challenged. If they reached the wrong aircraft, it might not start. If they were too slow, reinforcements would arrive. If the engines failed, they would be trapped in a metal coffin. If they took off wrong, they would crash. If they flew wrong, they would be shot down. Devyatayev was honest about the odds, telling them they were probably going to die, but emphasizing that they were definitely going to die if they stayed. Every man agreed, and they set the date for February 8, 1945. On the morning of the escape, light snow fell on Peenemünde, reducing visibility and providing perfect cover. Devyatayev's group was assigned to runway maintenance, a standard work detail they had performed for weeks. Their guard was new and young, unfamiliar with their faces and not watching closely. They worked slowly, gathering heavy tools and moving into position while waiting for the moment. At 12:15, the guard stepped into a drainage ditch to relieve himself, hidden from the watchtowers and alone with the prisoners for 30 seconds. Krivonogov moved instantly, raising a shovel and bringing it down. The guard dropped without a sound, and the prisoners stripped his uniform quickly. Ivan Krivonogov put it on, though it was too tight across the shoulders, hoping that from a distance in the snow it would pass. Now disguised as a work detail with a guard escort, Krivonogov barked orders in rough German, and the other 9 prisoners fell into line, marching toward the airfield with their hearts pounding and eyes fixed forward. They were 400 meters from the aircraft when a real guard approached, a Wehrmacht enlisted man with a rifle on his shoulder. Devyatayev's group kept marching while Krivonogov shouted something unintelligible. The real guard shrugged, perhaps assuming the bad accent belonged to a foreign volunteer among the thousands of non-German personnel at the base, and let them pass. At 100 meters, they saw aircraft GA sitting on the tarmac with 2 German mechanics working nearby. The engines were cold, but the fuel tanks were full. As the group approached, Krivonogov gave a command, and the prisoners scattered toward the Heinkel as if assigned to work on it. The mechanics looked up in confusion, not expecting a work detail, but before they could speak, Kuturgin and Yemets were on them with fists and elbows, knocking them unconscious. Devyatayev ran for the cockpit, finding the door unlocked, and climbed inside. The instrument panel stretched before him, a confusing array of controls and labels he could not read. He had perhaps 3 minutes before someone noticed the fallen mechanics. Mikhail Devyatayev, weighing 38 kilograms, sat in the pilot's seat and tried to remember how to fly. The aircraft smelled of fuel and leather, a testament to German engineering, where every switch had a specific place. He had memorized the sequence of hand movements from watching other pilots, but executing them was different. He found what he thought was the fuel primer and pumped it, then flipped the ignition switches, but nothing happened. The other prisoners were piling into the aircraft, 9 men crowding into a space designed for 5, watching in panic as Devyatayev sat frozen. He realized he was missing a step, likely the battery switch. Scanning the panel, he found a likely toggle and flipped it up, causing the instrument lights to flicker on. He tried the ignition again, and the left engine coughed, sputtered, and caught, the propeller beginning to spin. He repeated the sequence for the right engine, and soon both were running. However, they were not out yet. Devyatayev had never taxied a twin-engine aircraft, which used differential braking for steering. Pressing the left brake turned the plane left, and the right brake turned it right. He released the wheel brakes, and the Heinkel began to roll too fast, heading toward another parked aircraft. He stamped on the left brake, causing the bomber to lurch and slew sideways, almost tipping over. The prisoners in the back were thrown against the walls, cursing, but Devyatayev found a balance, making gentle corrections to let the aircraft find its path. Behind them, someone finally noticed the unauthorized movement and shouted in German, triggering an alarm. They were 500 meters from the runway threshold when a truck appeared from behind a hangar, filled with soldiers racing toward the taxiing bomber. If the truck reached them before takeoff, the soldiers would shoot through the cockpit windows or ram the aircraft. Devyatayev reached the runway and turned the bomber to align with the center line. The truck was gaining, now only 100 meters behind. He pushed both throttles forward, unleashing the power of the engines. The Heinkel HW-111 weighed 14,000 kilograms fully loaded and required 400 meters of runway to reach takeoff speed, along with 50 pounds of pull on the control column to lift the nose. Devyatayev pulled the column toward his chest, but it did not move. His muscles, consumed by 8 months of starvation, could not generate the force. The Heinkel was racing down the runway at 140 kilometers per hour, but the nose would not lift. Behind them, the truck had reached the runway edge, and soldiers were jumping out to raise their rifles. Devyatayev screamed for help, and Sokolov and Kuturgin stumbled forward through the chaos to grab the control column with him. 3 men pulled together, bullets cracking past the cockpit as someone in the back screamed that they had been hit. The nose rose just slightly, the wheels left the ground, and the aircraft became airborne at 12:21 in the afternoon. They climbed into the gray sky as snow swirled around the wings, and the airfield fell away below. For a brief moment, there was silence, and then Peenemunde's air defense batteries opened fire. Anti-aircraft rounds burst around the Heinkel, sending black puffs of smoke and shrapnel pinging off the fuselage. Devyatayev threw the aircraft into a banking turn, first west to confuse the pursuit, then north over the Baltic Sea, and finally east towards Soviet lines. The German crews tracked them for 2 minutes before the bomber disappeared into the clouds. Inside, chaos reigned as one prisoner was wounded and stripped a piece of his uniform to bandage the injury. The Heinkel shuddered and groaned, its extent of damage unknown, its fuel levels uncertain, and its exact location a mystery to the pilot, who could only read the compass. Devyatayev flew by instinct, heading east toward the front line. The altitude indicator showed 2,000 meters, and the speed was 280 kilometers per hour. The fuel gauge needle was dropping significantly, suggesting they were burning through reserves or had a leak. After 50 minutes, smoke began trailing from the left engine, damage from the anti-aircraft fire finally manifesting. Devyatayev adjusted the fuel mixture and reduced power to the damaged engine, fighting the controls as the aircraft tried to yaw left. Below, the landscape changed to show shell craters and burned villages, signs of recent combat indicating they were approaching the front. Then, Soviet anti-aircraft batteries spotted the German bomber flying toward their positions. In a cruel twist of fate, the Soviets did not ask questions. They opened fire on the approaching Heinkel. Tracer rounds rose from the ground, and Devyatayev tried to evade, but the heavy, damaged bomber was too slow. Bullets ripped through the fuselage and the left engine exploded in actual flames, oil spraying across the wing as the engine died. On one engine, the Heinkel could not maintain altitude and began dropping fast. From 1,000 meters down to 600, Devyatayev saw Soviet trenches and artillery positions below. He had seconds to decide whether to try for a proper airfield and risk the second engine quitting, or to crash land immediately. He aimed for a snow-covered field and pulled back on the controls. The Heinkel hit the ground with the force of a bomb, the landing gear collapsing instantly as the belly scraped across the frozen earth. Metal tore and the propeller disintegrated into shrapnel, spraying snow everywhere. The bomber slid for 200 meters before finally stopping. Devyatayev, alive but bleeding and shaking, looked back to see that all 9 men were moving. They scrambled through the exits and crawled away from the wreckage as fuel dripped onto the hot metal. Soviet soldiers sprinted toward them from the trenches with rifles raised, yelling in Russian. Devyatayev stood up, a 38-kilogram figure in concentration camp stripes covered in blood and fuel, and shouted that they were Soviet and had escaped from Peenemunde. When he identified himself as Lieutenant Mikhail Devyatayev of the Soviet Air Force, who had stolen the plane from a Nazi rocket base, the soldiers looked at each other in disbelief. The nightmare did not end there, as Soviet counterintelligence took them into custody immediately, treating them not as heroes, but as suspects. For weeks they were interrogated, asked how they survived when millions died, and how they learned to fly German aircraft. They were suspected of being spies or collaborators. Devyatayev told them everything about Peenemunde, the V-2 rockets, and the launch sites, intelligence that would eventually help the Soviet space program, but he received no thanks. He was sent to a penal military unit while still under suspicion. The war ended 3 months later, and while they released Devyatayev, they did not restore his rank or pilot status, nor did they call him a hero. He went home and disappeared into silence, his story classified because Soviet doctrine viewed anyone who survived captivity as a potential traitor. For 12 years, Mikhail Devyatayev lived as a forgotten man, working a regular job in obscurity while the Soviet Union used the intelligence he provided to build their space race.